today's presentation. We're extremely lucky to have Gordon Haave as a guest. He's a brilliant financial mind and is the Chief Investment Officer at FTA Portfolios. And thank you to Amanda for putting this together. Amanda is indispensable, and I will introduce her shortly. Any point during this presentation, if you have a question, just hover your cursor down at the bottom of your screen and click on the chat icon. And we will, or I should say the appropriate person will respond to your question during the Q&A portion of the presentation. I'm not going to read this disclosure. It'll be in the recording, but it essentially says that this presentation is for informational purposes only, that nobody talking today is authorized to give tax or legal or investment advice in such a broad-based format without knowing the customer. And of course, we're not affiliated with any government agency that might be mentioned. So I'm going to introduce the team, which includes our special guest, Gordon. He'll tell us how we got to where we are this year, what the rest of the year looks like, and then answer questions and talk about next steps. So that's me on the left. I'm the founder and owner of Dwell Wealth Preservation. I'm affiliated with many of the best partners across the country, including Gordon and his team in St. Louis. And I've been in the business a long time. I'm not going to tell you how many decades. Amanda is my new assistant, and I feel extremely fortunate to have found her. She's brilliant, hardworking, wonderful person to work with, and brings some amazing credentials with her, including the ability to put together an event like this.
Thanks, Gary.
Gordon, I first met, I think last year in St. Louis at a gathering. Gordon reads a book a week, and I could make that claim also, but Gordon actually understands a book a week. It's reflected in what he says and does. We're extremely lucky to have him here today. Of all of his quotes, my favorite is that happiness is a choice. And that's what keeps me in this business. That's why Amanda is working for me. Our goal is to create happiness for our clients by dealing with what is most important to them and removing fear and uncertainty from their finances. So Gordon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gary. Can everybody hear me? Gary, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right.
Yep, we can hear you.
I'll
Great.
mute myself.
So let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Gary, for the introduction. Now, there's a lot I can say about the state of the markets, Federal Reserve policy, our strategies, and I will right here in this presentation. But to really understand all of that, we need to answer the big question, which is what's going on? Now, I think I have the answer, and I'm going to take a few minutes to take you down the path I took to reach my conclusion about what's going on. Of course, what's driving everything right now in the markets is the coronavirus. We entered into this pandemic with a pretty strong economy. Markets were strong, employment was strong, building permits, just about every metric was looking good for the upcoming year. Then the virus hit. What was to be done? Well, back in March, we were all told about flattening the curve. Scientists and health experts around the world all knew, based on hundreds of years of accumulated medical knowledge, that the way to deal with this was to flatten the curve. Now, the idea behind flattening the curve was that by slowing the transmission rate of the virus, we could prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed. If hospitals were overwhelmed, then there would be excess deaths, as hospitals would not be able to cope with the number of cases. By flattening the curve and spreading the infections out over time, we could prevent those excess deaths. However, we were told that flattening the curve would not reduce the number of infections. It was explicitly explained that the same number of people would get infected, just that those infections would be spread out over time, which would prevent the excess deaths that would otherwise result from an overwhelmed healthcare system. Flattening the curve would have justified imposing social distancing upon people and other measures. Flattening the curve worked. New York City came close to being overwhelmed, but was not, or at least not by much. So logically speaking, it was then time to open up after the curve in New York City was flattened. This did not mean that there would be no more cases or no more hotspots, but rather that the virus would be allowed to spread through society, but in a controlled manner. If there was a hotspot that was in danger of being overwhelmed, that hotspot could shut down to make sure the curve was flattened. Yet we don't hear about flattening the curve anymore. Everybody was an expert on this back in March. Now, this concept of flattening the curve, built on all the sustained medical knowledge about how to treat a viral pandemic, isn't discussed anymore. Instead, the media talks about defeating it, about driving the number of cases to zero. Well, why is that? And that's the big question. There's a number of different reasons, but a lot of the reasons have the same common theme. Now, take a look at the slide on your screen. What do these various groups of people have in common? First, there are over 30 million or more people who, up until July 31st, were getting $600 per week. For many of them, that was more than they made in their jobs. For many of them, they made more in their jobs, but would rather make less if it meant they don't have to go to work. In an email to advisors, such as Gary, back in May, I talked about how many of these people simply weren't going to go back to work. And I'll get into that in detail in a little bit. But anyways, this large group of people, these chronically and or hopefully unemployed, along with other groups of people out there, Antifa, BLM, what you might call Sanders progressives, climate change activists, they all have something else going on in common. Now, first of all, my only politics is making money for my clients, okay? There's no judgment here whatsoever. But all of these groups have one thing in common. They all have a deep detachment or disenchantment with society at large. And curiously, although BLM should have nothing to do with coronavirus or Antifa, all of these groups are deeply attached to the idea of abandoning the concept of flattening the curve and instead pushing lockdowns until we reach this mythical situation where we just shut it down and defeat it. And so all of them have attached the coronavirus issue into their larger concerns for some sort of social justice. And I would add that various forms of what might be called the elite, from the media to certain institutions or corporations, are afraid of Trump winning re-election. They do not believe he's a good steward of the American economy or the government in total. And they're afraid that he will somehow stumble through all of this and come out on top. Now, by and large, the people who have completely abandoned the concept of flattening the curve mostly all see COVID-19 in a larger framework of justice and societal change. Now, I read a lot of books, as Gary said. We talk about them a lot. Typically, I read one book per month, and I listen to about one Audible book per month. I live very close to the office. In spring and fall, I walk to work. But when I'm driving to work, I don't get to too much time on my Audible books. But I was recently reading a book called Ring of Steel, Germany and Austria-Hungary in World War I by Alexander Watson. It's not a very good book about World War I. It gets a lot of things wrong, but it's primarily about German and Austro-Hungarian civil society in World War I. Now, just as a brief recap, the Germans went to war in 1914 with the greatest military machine ever up until that time. It was the most well-armed and well-trained fighting force the world had ever seen. The German people were promised a quick victory. That didn't happen, and the advance stalled out. After a year of inconclusive fighting, but one in which the Germans proved themselves tactically to be superior and masters of the battlefield, inflicting nearly 3-to-1 casualties on their opponents, the Germans launched the Verdun offensive, designed to break the French army, which, the German people were told, would bring a quick end to the war. And that didn't happen either, although it came close. Then the German people were told that unrestricted submarine warfare would knock England out of the war and bring the war to a successful conclusion. And it looked for a few months that it just might work, but that too didn't end the war. Then in 1918, the Germans defeated the Russians in the east and were able to transfer 1 million soldiers to the west, and they launched the 1918 spring offensive. Using their superior tactics, they smashed through the British and French lines. The French were on the ropes, and the British commanders were drawing up plans to evacuate France. But after weeks of fighting in which the Germans lost their best young officers and men, they ran smack into the first 500,000 men of the American Expeditionary Force. Now, what did this mean? What it meant for Germany was that the war was lost. The Germans fought on hard for many months, but with 100,000 Americans arriving every month, there was just no path to victory. Germany at this time was run practically by a military dictatorship, but the people had had enough. In the fall of 1918, across both Germany and Austria-Hungary, huge swaths of society walked out of work, turned off their ammunition production lines, and decided the war wasn't worth fighting anymore. And they brought the war to an end by simply refusing to participate in civil society and the economy anymore. This is a mass strike. A mass strike like this is called a general strike. The strikes that ended World War I are probably the most famous and effective general strikes. Now, we haven't had general strikes in the United States, but they're a common feature of European history. When a vast swath of society feels completely detached from its leadership and society, Europeans have engaged in general strikes. And it hit me a few weeks ago. That's sort of what's going on here. A significant part of the population, is it 20%, is it 30%, is basically refusing to engage in work or civil society until there is broad and fundamental change. So what does that mean? Well, let's review a little bit some of the things I've said for the last few months. Now, the first question is, where were we heading into all of this? Heading into it, the economy was strong. The graph on your screen shows building permits leading into the start of past recessions. The red line is 2020. And as you can see, leading into this event, we were likely not heading into a recession, as building permits were ticking up leading into the event. Whereas you can see, usually heading into recessions, building permits are ticking down. This graph of initial unemployment claims shows something similar. As you can see, initial claims usually rise heading into a recession. But in 2020, which is the red line, initial claims are actually going down prior to the COVID event. I like to look at economic surprise indexes. There are a number of them. Citibank has the best. But looking at the Citibank Economic Surprise Index, it was very strong leading into the COVID-19 event. Plus, I like to look back at past economic shocks. Now, I put this in an email to Gary and others on March 12th and observed that the stock market had already plunged during this event as much as it had after 9/11 and the 1998 Russian default. So really going forward, there probably wasn't going to be much more downside in the stock market. So back in mid-March, we were looking at a strong economy heading into the crisis, and it looked in mid-March like we might be likely at the bottom, and we were hoping for a V-shaped recovery. That is, an economic recovery that recovers very quickly and goes on. On March 30th, in another email to Gary and others, I showed this graph. This is a graph of commercial paper rates. What is commercial paper? Well, commercial paper is a funding mechanism that corporations use to gain cash or liquidity. And why does this matter? Well, one of the main drivers of what we do here at FTA is based on something called the Wixelian cumulative process. I'll explain what that is. Knut Wicksell was a Swedish economist who was prolific in his writings in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he sought to figure out what drives asset price booms and busts like the stock market. And he came up with something called the Wickelsian cumulative process, which says this, that in the economy as a whole, there's a cost of capital and there's a return on capital. And when the cost and return on capital diverge, money goes flowing into capital assets, causing a boom. When the cost and return on capital converge, money goes flowing out rapidly, causing a bust. And as you can see, the cost of capital rose dramatically at the start of the crisis. But then, due largely to Federal Reserve intervention, the cost of capital was plummeting by the end of March. So just backing up what I said earlier, that by the end of March, things were looking pretty good. At the same time, on March 30th, while the cost of capital was falling rapidly, it looked like the COVID-19 curve was flattening and the virus was getting under control. On April 6th, in another email to Gary and other advisors, I showed this graph of new cases and recoveries in Italy, showing that Italy was past their peak. And the same thing in Spain. Although the media was still panicking, cases were coming down and it looked like Spain was getting things under control. On April 6th, I said that I expect a peak of US deaths sometime around mid-month, followed by a loosening of restrictions 2 weeks later, around May 1st. Such a scenario should almost certainly be bullish for the stock market, as it'll be combined with the massive stimulus announced in the CARES Act. And sure enough, in April, mid-April, New York City cases started coming down, and we were still hoping for a V-shaped recovery. And this was certainly a time to be bullish. This graph showed that the Fed was pumping liquidity into the market. What does that mean? It means using newly created money by the Fed to buy bonds. This has the effect of driving down the cost of capital. This graph shows that usually the Fed is late to the party creating excess liquidity, well after the start of bear markets. But this time the Fed was Johnny on the spot. Now, as a side note, one can argue if bailing out the markets is a good idea. I think in the long run it's not, but that's neither here nor there. We always need to react to what we observe is going on and not to how we think things ought to be. Now, my positive outlook started to change quite a bit in an email I sent to Gary and others on May 7th. At that point in time, I had strong doubts about a V-shaped economic recovery. A significant portion of the population then, at that point I realized, now believed that the economy should stay closed until cases are brought to near zero and or there was a vaccine. And this threatened any recovery, as much of the population would not return to work despite the then current and scheduled reopenings. In fact, the CARES Act encouraged such behavior. For workers, the act did two main things. It expanded who could be eligible to receive unemployment benefits through the end of 2020, and it provided an additional $600 per week in unemployment payments through July 31st. Now, those are now paused, but I think we're going to see them again shortly. While the implementation of the CARES Act can vary from state to state, broadly speaking, there are vast numbers of people who are able to receive unemployment than there would be under normal unemployment benefit rules. Three noteworthy provisions were the enhanced $600 per week benefit structure, the provision allowing for unemployment for people who have left their jobs to take care of someone, whether it's due to COVID-19 specifically, or the school or facility that used to care for them is now closed, as well as a certain number of people who quit their jobs due to COVID-19. Now, while this third provision does have limits and restrictions on what a good justification for quitting was, there is no mechanism in place to police millions of unemployment claims. Now, academics have long understood that unemployment legislation lengthens recessions, as unemployment legislation reduces the incentive for workers to find a job, any job, during a downturn. Simply put, despite the reopenings, many workers were not going to return to work anytime soon. This did not bode well for corporate America and thus the stock market. BlackRock's chairman Larry Fink predicted mass bankruptcies, empty planes, cautious consumers, and an increase in the corporate tax rate to as high as 29%. These were part of the vision that Fink sketched out on a call that week. The question becomes then, how do we prepare you, our clients, for a market that is currently being boosted by federal government and Federal Reserve stimulus, but is not likely to be a V-shaped recovery? Well, so first of all, our portfolios are risk managed. Most FTA portfolios are currently in a risk-off position. What does that mean? It means that most of our portfolios, the exposure has shifted from equities to bonds. Some of our portfolios remain in the risk-on position and have remained so this summer. Specifically, the US prime dividend and the NASDAQ leaders strategy. These strategies represent the largest companies in the market and are in the best position to navigate the current crisis and to use their market and lobbying clout to take advantage of the current situation and to both survive and position themselves to prosper in the next market cycle. And this view turned out pretty well. Everyone's talking about the recovery in stocks hitting new highs, but it's mostly the mega caps which are driving most of the returns. Excuse me 1 minute. Okay, so what sort of changed since then? Well, I wrote much of this presentation a few weeks ago, and I was largely going to tell you to stay the course, that one would want to be defensive except with exposure to the mega caps through the election. It would have been easy to predict that what has happened the last few months would continue on at least through the election. The Fed would do what it does and continue to try to prop up the markets. And at the same time, it was unlikely there would be any change in fiscal policy. In fact, I have 2 slides I put in here a few weeks ago to illustrate this point. The $600 employment benefits were about to be extended. They've not been, but I think they still would be. And also, on this date, when I just sort of copied this tweet and threw it in the slide, the stock market was down 1.5% during the day. And what happened? The Federal Reserve immediately jumped in to transact with 3 loan programs. Well, what does that mean? It means they will buy bonds using newly created money to prop up the markets. This also has the effect of preventing borrowing costs from rising. So it would have been very easy to stand here and predict what the next few months would like, and perhaps it still is. But I was still a little bit uncertain what's going on. And now I think I understand what's going on in what I told you earlier, that I think for a significant part of the population, there's essentially an undeclared general strike. And what this means is that fiscal and monetary stimulus is likely to occur far beyond just the next few months through the election. As a vast swath of society effectively refuses to participate in society and the economy until there's some sort of fundamental change. So where do we go from here? Well, about 10 days ago, I reread another book that I'd read some time ago. It's called Monetary Regimes and Inflation by Peter Bernhold. It came out in 2006. And I'd read it before, but I reread it. Why? Because I wanted to know, what does it mean if there is massive and long-term monetary and fiscal stimulus? In the book, Bernhold looks at the characteristics of all 29 hyperinflations of the 20th century. And what does he find? In all cases, hyperinflations have occurred when the ratio of budget deficits to expenditures is greater than 40%, and 90% of those deficits are monetized. What does that mean? Monetization means when budget deficits are covered, not by selling bonds to savers, but when the bonds are bought by the central bank with newly printed money. Now, to be clear, I'm not calling for hyperinflation, but follow with me here for a minute. How do these numbers look in the US right now? The US has so far announced fiscal stimulus of $2.9 trillion. If we assume revenues remain constant over the next year and assume other expenditures outside of the fiscal stimulus remain the same, on this basis, the budget deficit ratio will rise from 30% to 55% in a year's time. The monetization ratio is now almost 40% in the US, up from only 0 at the beginning of the year. So remember, the two figures for hyperinflation were 40% on the budget deficit ratio and 90% on monetization. We've already smashed through the budget deficit ratio, going from 30 to 55%. And while the monetization ratio is only 40%, that's up from just 0 8 months ago. Now, this does not mean high inflation is imminent. Inflation can remain subdued in this regime for some time, potentially years. However, when inflation does emerge, it's likely to occur how Hemingway once described how one goes bankrupt. That is, first gradually, then suddenly. So when it happens, it will happen quickly. In the meantime, we can see in the US there's a well-defined leading relationship between discretionary government spending and rising inflation, or CPI. The Congressional Budget Office projections used in this chart are from March, before the coronavirus crisis took hold. So when the next ones are released, we should expect this to be even higher. But rising discretionary government spending is increasing the likelihood of a rise in inflation, if only in the short term, let alone the long term. So what does this mean? Well, let's say we're actually looking at longer term inflation. Remember, we are not necessarily talking about a hyperinflation like when we think of Bolivia, but think of it this way. I started in this business part-time in 1992, full-time in 1995. In my entire career, people have been warning about inflation that has never come. There's always a little bit of inflation, but people have been warning about 70s style inflation my entire career, and it's never come. Yields have gone lower and lower. So we shouldn't be, and you shouldn't be panicking in a sort of, oh my God, inflation's coming. Because people who have been saying that have been wrong for 40 years. What I am saying is this: it's now in the cards, and it's something to start thinking about. So what happened the last time there was inflation? Well, that was in the 1970s. At the time, the places to be were commodities first, treasuries second, corporates third, and stocks fourth. Real estate also did well, but unfortunately I could not find some definitive data for this graph. In any event, what are we talking about here, and how does it affect your portfolios? What I'm saying is, over time, we should be shifting ever so slightly up this chain from equities to corporates to treasuries to commodities. Not a lot, but ever so slightly. We should start being prepared for this. Now, and then in equities, we should be focusing on the mega caps. Now, we've been doing this. I already told you our portfolios have gone into a risk-off position, most of them, which has the effect of shifting equities from both corporates to treasuries. So this is what we're looking at. This is what Gary will be talking to you about the next time you do reviews. And that's it. Matt, do we have any questions? Oh, okay, we've got one. So first question is, what does the election look like, and how might the election affect stocks? This is always a tough one. It's hard to predict how politicians affect stock markets. What I will say is this: the stock market, although hopefully you understand it's extraordinarily volatile and not always explainable, in the long term, the stock market is priced based on today's value of future projected profits. So when Trump was elected, the stock market proceeded to go up significantly for a while. And the reason for that is Trump reduced taxes. He cut regulations, both things that tend to lead to higher corporate profits. He also pushed through a bill to allow for corporations to repatriate their foreign earnings to the US at a reduced rate. That had an effect of boosting the stock market, as most of that money was just used for stock buybacks. So the question, I guess, is what happens if Biden wins? As I said, I'm not political. My politics is making money for my clients. Based on what I just said, you could argue that the stock market might not take well to a Biden victory, because it's most likely that taxes would go up under a Biden victory. There are two main points, though, at which I would argue perhaps against that. I believe he will increase taxes, but to the extent you should be concerned about it, it's a possible concern, but I don't think it's a big one, and here's why. These arguments were largely used back when I started my career, and then later, to argue that the stock market would perform poorly under first Clinton and then Obama. That clearly did not happen. Why didn't that happen? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is, as much as the nation's polarized and our political parties fight many battles over many issues, my personal belief is that when it comes to the fundamental operation of the economy, they're largely the same. I don't believe anyone's basically threatening the capitalist system, corporate domination of the political process, and so forth. And you can see that today in the stock market, right? I already told you that the stock market's priced based on, in the long run, based on projected forward earnings. Here we have Biden dramatically up in the polls, and yet the stock market's hitting new highs. Now, while the stock market's largely up because of Federal Reserve intervention, if the market was clearly concerned about a Biden victory, I would think we would see that being a little bit muted. Matt, anything else?
Yeah, one more question. Someone asks, can you say more about how specifically people are engaging in a general, he put stock, but I imagine he means strike.
Sure. The question is, how do I think people engaging are in general strike? I mean, basically, the desire to shut down the economy, the desire to shut down the schools. And I'm not saying anybody who believes that is engaging in a general strike. There are obviously arguments over that. But it's curious to me that the people most vociferously for keeping the economy closed all happen to be those who are most disenchanted with society at the moment. So I believe that it's more than political. Everyone talks about follow the science, but it's curious that it's very political. And again, I'm not passing judgment. I believe it's understandable why certain groups of society are disenchanted with it, but it's clearly become a political issue. All right, that's it. Gary, back to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much, Gordon. Always appreciate your level-headed, evidence-based opinions on things. The breath of fresh air. So I, Amanda, and all the teams that I've assembled across the country get a great deal of pleasure out of helping people reduce uncertainty in their retirement futures. So if you or anyone you know is feeling stressed right now, here's our contact information. If you have any additional questions, you can just call me or send me an email. If you would like to meet, either for a first meeting or a review, there's my calendar link. So I'm not going to keep you. Thanks again, Gordon, Ben, for setting this up, and Amanda especially for getting all the details arranged. And thanks to all of you who have attended.